Hello. In this video, I will explain how camera exposure works and how you control it using the different settings on your camera. Now, the website that we're going to look at and use is called Cambridge in Color, and it's a great website, great resource for understanding different camera techniques. And different concepts relative to photography. So today we're going to look at exposure specifically, because controlling exposure is controlling the camera to allow the amount of light into the lens based upon the conditions to get an overall effect. And it's important because this is how a photographer can create different effects and different types of photographs without having to do a lot of extra editing. The more work you can do with the camera, the less work you have to do in After Effects and editing. So I think it's important that we learn how to control the camera, and that's where we're going to start. So you have to know what exposure is, and you have to know what the different settings mean on the camera in order to control the exposure. So first, let's talk a little bit about what exposure is. So exposure is the amount of light that enters the lens. In my experience, controlling exposure for beginning photographers is something that is easy in theory, but to put it into practice can be a little bit more complicated, and it does take some practice. It does take some time for you to understand how small changes in your exposure, in the amount of light that you let in, can really create a very dramatic effect in your finished product. So when photographers talk about images, and they talk about images being either underexposed or overexposed, what we mean is there's either too little light that's been let into the lens or too much light that's been let into the lens. Now, the amount of light determines both the brightness and darkness of the image. It determines how vivid the colors are, and it determines the values. So when a photo is underexposed, meaning too little light is collected, it will generally be darker because there hasn't been enough light that's been collected. The colors will be more muted, and it will be what's referred to as low key, meaning the value range goes from dark to middle rather than all the way from dark to light. Now, when a photo is overexposed and too much light is collected, it's going to be high key. It's going to have really bright white lights, but it's not going to have dark shadows. It's not going to have those rich, vibrant colors. It's going to be more washed out, is how we usually refer to it. Now, the analogy that they make here on the website about understanding exposure is thinking of the lens as like a bucket. And if that bucket has and you're filling that bucket with light, and you fill it from a source that has a very wide opening. So, you're filling it through a funnel with a very wide opening, more light's going to get in. And that's basically what your lens is like. Your lens is like that funnel. If it has a very wide opening, then more light's going to get in. And if it has a very narrow opening, then less light's going to get in. And we refer to that amount of light as aperture. Okay? Aperture is part of 1/3 of the exposure triangle. Aperture, ISO speed, and shutter speed. Now, aperture controls the area. It means how wide the opening in the lens is. So if it's very wide, it's going to let more light in, and if it's very narrow, it's going to let less light in. Shutter speed controls how quickly or slowly the shutter opens and closes. If the shutter opens very quickly, it's going to let less light in. But it's also going to, with a fast shutter speed, we can actually freeze motion, and we'll talk about that in a minute. ISO speed controls the sensitivity of the camera's sensor. The sensor is what the light is hitting. So when the light enters the lens, in a traditional camera, it bounces off of a mirror, and then it bounces from that mirror onto the sensor. The sensor is part of the camera's inner computer workings, and that sensor, it gathers the light and it interprets it based upon its intensity and wavelength towards a color, which is where we get the color image from. Now, the ISO speed is the sensitivity of the camera's sensor to a given amount of light. When you make the ISO higher, it will be more sensitive, which means you'll actually need less light to get a clear image. So under darker conditions, if you elevate the camera's ISO speed, you can actually get a brighter image, which is how cameras can actually see in the dark. Now, when you turn that ISO speed up significantly, what happens is you end up getting what's referred to as camera noise. It's more difficult under those lower light conditions, even with a high sensitivity, the high sensitivity of a high ISO speed, to determine the edges of shapes and objects. Now, if you've seen cameras that shoot in infrared or cameras that shoot in what they refer to as night vision, those cameras are actually collecting light with a very, very high ISO speed, which is what tends to make the images grainier because that noise, that extra noise. So we can control each of these three pieces of exposure. Shutter speed is the simplest of the three to understand. It's really how quickly the shutter opens and closes. The average shutter speed is about 1/50th to 1/100th of a second. Now, that might sound like a really, really short duration, 1/50th of a second or 1/100th of a second. And it is, especially considering, or when we think about how our eyes work. And that's one of the most important things for you to understand from the beginning. Cameras do not work the way our eyes work. Our eyes work on basically a constant stream of light, versus cameras capture a very, very small amount of light and then interpret that light. Now, under normal shutter speed conditions, you would use those for things that are relatively still and where you have lighting conditions that are relatively normal. So if you're under natural light outside and you're taking a picture of your friend who's just standing still, you would probably use just a regular average shutter speed of 1/50th to 1/100th. Now, if, say for instance, you're under the same conditions outside, natural light, and you're trying to take a picture of an animal in motion, like your dog running around, and you want to freeze that motion, then you're going to want to increase your shutter speed, meaning make it faster so that the shutter opens faster and closes faster. Now, to freeze action or movement, the typical shutter speed for most moving objects is going to be between 1/250th and 1/500th of a second. At 1/500th of a second, you can actually freeze the motion of a car traveling at a relatively high rate of speed. Now, if you need to freeze extremely fast objects or objects that are very close to the camera, you might need to get as high as 1/1000th of a second up to 1/4000th of a second. Our high-end DSLR cameras that we use, they can actually freeze motion. The fastest that we have in our studio is about 1/3200th of a second. And that will actually freeze the wings of a hummingbird in motion in flight, where you can see in crisp detail, if you have enough light, the wings and the feathers. Now, the opposite of fast shutter speed is slow shutter speed. Slower shutter speed is anything less than 1/50th of a second. And with slower shutter speeds, instead of freezing the motion, you're going to actually capture the motion, and you'll get what's called motion blur. So in these two examples, you see the slow shutter speed makes the movement of the water look like a ribbon. And so even though we know that the water is clear, it appears white because the light that's bouncing off of it is actually moving under that slow shutter speed condition. Under slow shutter speed conditions, we can also get ribbons of light, instead not just water movement, but light movement. So if you've ever seen those images with what photographers refer to as light trails, where like cars are moving and their brake lights look like they're a ribbon of light, that's done with a slow shutter speed. Now, a fast shutter speed, like on the right, can actually freeze the motion. And when we're in the studio, we have several of the plasma balls to take photos just like the one you see there. That's part of what we do as part of our project on shutter speed. Now, aperture setting is like controlling the size of that funnel that I mentioned. So a lower aperture is actually going to make a wider opening, and that's going and that is referred to as the f-stop number. As the f-stop number increases, the diameter of the opening decreases. So a higher f-stop number means the opening in the lens will be smaller versus a lower f-stop number where the opening is going to be wider. You use higher f-stop numbers under average light conditions because the higher f-stop number, you need more light to come in. You need natural light, basically. Under lower f-stop conditions, you're going to need more than just natural light. So if you're going to shoot at a very low f-stop number, it allows you to get very close to your subject, but you're probably going to need either a flash or some other light source in order to get enough light to enter into the lens. The benefit of using a lower f-stop number is that it allows you to take pictures in crisp, clear focus of objects that are closer to you. Sometimes we refer to this process as macro photography, or taking images of very small objects that are very close to the camera. For landscapes, where you're taking pictures of wide open spaces, where you want most of the frame to be in focus, you're going to want to use a higher f-stop number. You can control the f-stop in what's known as aperture priority settings on most of all the DSLR cameras, and even some of the point and shoot cameras allow for this control. If you download that app, Camera FV5 Lite, that I mentioned in my talk online, then you're going to be able to control the f-stop number with the camera on your phone. Normal phone apps don't allow you to control f-stop. You can make it lighter or darker, but you can't actually set the f-stop. But with that free app, Camera FV5 Lite, you are able to control the f-stop specifically. Now, the benefit to controlling the f-stop is that it allows you to get a shallow depth of field, like you see on the left, where the background will be softened or fuzzy. And that allows you to control and focus the viewer's attention on an object that's in the foreground. With a narrow aperture, meaning a higher f-stop number, where the amount of light that enters is narrowed, you get a larger depth of field, which is more beneficial for landscape photos. So you want to remember that. A small object that's close up, probably a low f-stop number. A wide open space, probably a high f-stop number. ISO speed is the least common of the three parts of the aperture or the exposure triangle that are controlled. Most of the time, we don't control ISO speed unless we're trying to get a very specific effect. Most cameras, ISO is controlled automatically, meaning I set the f-stop, I find my desired conditions, then the camera will actually set the ISO based upon those conditions. However, there are times where we might want to force the camera for effect, to add some of that noise or grain. And in that case, you would want to manually turn the ISO speed up higher. Or, like I mentioned before, under certain lighting conditions, it might be beneficial to have a higher ISO speed. But you have to accept the fact that with higher ISO speeds is going to come some of that graininess. Now, All of the cameras, whether it's a Canon camera or any other kind of camera, are going to have some of the same exposure modes. Most people, regardless of how much money they spend on their camera, how fancy it is, how much control that it has, most people shoot the entire time or use their camera and never turn it out of auto mode. Auto mode assumes that you're going to want everything to be a certain way. It's not going to let you control the f-stop. It's not going to let you control anything. The problem with auto mode is that it limits the type of imagery that we can create. And what I want you to be able to do is to choose to make images the way that you want to make them. And so we're going to get out of auto mode as quickly as possible. Most of the time, you're going to shoot in what's known as aperture priority mode, or AV or AP mode on most cameras. It allows you to specify the aperture and the ISO, and the camera determines the shutter speed. If you want to control all three parts, you'll need to shoot in manual. Manual allows you to control all three of the areas, regardless of whether or not they match they lead to a correct exposure. And so when you're in auto mode, the camera is going to say, well, you don't want a grainy image, you don't want a blurry image, you don't want it to be out of focus, you don't want it to be softened, or a soft focus. And so it's going to fix that for you. It's going to assume that you don't want any of those things. But there are times perhaps where you're attempting to create something stylistic where you do want those things. And in order to do that, you have to turn it out of auto mode and into either AV or manual mode. Now, there are some specific modes that you'll find on most cameras, like portrait, landscape, sports, or action. And what they're doing, if you tell it, I'm taking a portrait, it's going to try and pick the lowest f-stop possible, and it's going to make sure that to have the shallowest depth of field possible. If I put it in landscape mode, it's going to do the exact opposite. It's not really letting me controlling it. I'm just telling the camera what I want to do, what I want the auto mode to do for me. Now, there are certain times where putting it into those modes can actually be beneficial and easier for you to capture the effect. For instance, some processes, especially things like night photography, they take a lot more practice. And so at first, you might want to just put it into night or low light mode, and then that will help you, the camera will help you to make sure that you get the effect that you're looking for. But eventually, in order to be able to fully control the camera, you want to make sure you get out of those modes and into either AV or manual mode. Now, the value of understanding exposure is that it allows us to create different effects, to control those effects, not for it to be chance or circumstance, and to not have to do as much editing in post-production. So it's important that we practice these things, and we're going to actually do some exercises and some assignments to help practice these things to control exposure. All right, so if you have not already, the next step to be able to start controlling the exposure is to get that app for your phone, Camera FV5 Lite. It's free. You can download it in the App Store. There's also a professional version that's costed a few dollars that has a few more controls if you choose, but the free version works just fine. And what it's going to help you to do on your camera phone is to help you to control exposure and get more effects that way. All right. If you have any questions, please email me. If not, I will see you in the next video.